Welcome back to the Rock Vault, where the amps are always hot. Tonight we're cranking open the forgotten doors of the 1960s, uncovering heavy pioneers who shook smoky clubs with fuzz, feedback, and fury. These obscure metal forerunners laid the foundation for everything loud, dark, and unforgettable to come.
Are you ready? Aus America, kommen Blue Cheer mit ihr Hit, Summertime!
Few bands in the late 60s rattled the walls quite like San Francisco's Blue Cheer. Their sound was explosive, primal, and unapologetically loud. A sonic assault that felt less like a polished performance and more like a thunderstorm rolling through your speakers. Their debut album, Vinspus Eruptum, didn't just turn up the volume. It redefined what volume meant. With guitar distortion pushed to its breaking point, bass that growled like an engine, and drums that shook the floor, Blue Cheer were among the first to show rock could be downright dangerous. Their cover of Eddie Cochran's Summertime Blues wasn't just a reinterpretation. It was a complete reinvention. What was once a rockabilly anthem became a crushing proto-metal anthem, dripping with fuzz and aggression. Listeners who dropped the needle in '68 weren't just hearing a song, they were feeling an earthquake. Even Jim Morrison once quipped that Blue Cheer were the only band louder than the Doors. And that says it all. For those who were teenagers back then, the memory is etched forever. Picture the scene. A '68 Camaro parked under the summer sun, windows down, and Summertime Blues blasting so loud the whole block could feel it. Parents shook their heads, neighbors complained, but to the kids behind the wheel, it was liberation, pure rebellion pressed into vinyl. Blue Cheer embodied that spirit. They weren't about perfection, they were about power. Unfortunately, their rawness came at a cost. Overshadowed by more polished psychedelic peers like Jefferson Airplane or the Grateful Dead, Blue Cheer never achieved lasting mainstream fame. Yet their sonic blueprint, heaviness over harmony, grit over gloss, became the foundation of metal as we know it. Bands that followed, from Sabbath to Motorhead, owe a nod to the sheer volume and chaos that Blue Cheer unleashed first. Today, crate diggers and die-hard fans still talk about them in reverent tones. Drop the needle on Vinspus Eruptum, and you'll feel the same rush as listeners did in 1968. Wild, unruly, and gloriously loud. Blue Cheer may have been too raw for their time, but in that rawness lay their immortality. They proved heavy music wasn't coming. It had already arrived.
The sun is what I find.
Some bands feel like they were born in the wrong decade, and the Misunderstood were one of them. Originally from Riverside, California, this group crossed the Atlantic in the mid-'60s, only to unleash a sound so heavy and unrelenting that it baffled audiences and record execs alike. Their music fused psychedelia with sharp distortion, bottleneck guitar wails, and an intensity few of their peers dared to touch. Long before the term metal became a genre, the Misunderstood were already flirting with its dark edges. I Can Take You to the Sun captured that strange balance, ethereal on the surface, but with an unnerving bite underneath. Then came Children of the Sun, where the swirling feedback and aggressive solos hinted at something more primal than flower power. They weren't just playing rock, they were bending it, stretching it, and pushing it to a place that sounded alien in 1966. For those who stumbled across their recordings back then, the effect was unforgettable. Imagine standing in a dim London club, the walls sweating from the heat of packed bodies, as the Misunderstood ripped into a set that sounded like nothing else. While most bands leaned into the technicolor swirl of psychedelia, this group conjured something darker, otherworldly even. The kids in the audience weren't just hearing songs, they were witnessing a style of rock that felt like it was cracking open the future. Sadly, fate had other plans. Immigration issues, military conscription, and constant label struggles tore the band apart just as they were gaining momentum. They never got the chance to release a full-length album during their prime, leaving behind only a handful of singles and live recordings. But those fragments were enough to cement their legend among crate diggers and proto-metal historians. Today, listening to the Misunderstood feels like finding a time capsule that proves metal's roots run deeper than most realize. Their songs carry that raw tension between psychedelia and sheer heaviness, making them one of the true missing links in rock's evolution. They were loud, aggressive, and decades ahead of their time, forever misunderstood, but never forgotten.
Strange things happen if you stay, the devil will get you.
If you wanted to hear British rock flirting with metal before the decade even closed, you didn't have to look much further than Gun. This short-lived London power trio burned bright and fast, releasing their self-titled debut in 1968, a record that sounded heavier and more confrontational than nearly anything else coming out of swinging London. Their calling card was Race with the Devil, a hard-hitting single that tore onto the charts with a blend of distorted riffing, cinematic arrangements, and a rhythm section that felt like a tank rolling downhill. It was loud, brash, and just dangerous enough to make parents worry. And kids turn it up even louder. Gun's secret weapon was their ability to fuse weighty guitar work with dramatic flair. Adrian Gervitz's guitar lines were blistering and full of fire, but layered with orchestral flourishes and war-themed lyrics that made the music feel apocalyptic. Unlike the more whimsical psychedelia that dominated their peers, Gun leaned into aggression, giving their songs a cinematic punch that pointed directly toward hard rock and early metal. It was proto-metal in the rawest sense, born from blues roots, but transformed into something grittier, darker, and more primal. For the young fans of 1968, this music was a revelation. Imagine it. A rainy British night, tucked into your room with a brand new copy of Gun on the turntable. As the needle dropped, Race with the Devil exploded through the speakers, making your cheap record player sound like it was about to catch fire. For a generation already shaken by war protests, social upheaval, and a counterculture demanding change, Gun's sound mirrored that intensity. It wasn't escapist. It was a battle cry. The sound of a new era breaking free from the polite boundaries of traditional rock. Sadly, the band's momentum didn't last. Despite the promise of their debut and the success of their single, Gun never managed to capture the same lightning in a bottle again. The members eventually scattered into other projects, Adrian and Paul Gervitz later forming Three-Man Army and Baker Gervitz Army. But the shadow of Race with the Devil remained. That one track alone became a milestone, later covered by Judas Priest, cementing its influence in the evolution of heavy music. Today, when you listen back to Gun's 1968 recordings, you can hear the echoes of what was to come, the seeds of metal's growl, the tension of doom, and the ferocity of hard rock waiting just around the corner. They may not have had a long career, but in that short moment, Gun pointed a finger straight at the future and pulled the trigger. If there was ever a band that embodied the chaos of London's underground scene, it was The Deviants. Formed in the mid-60s and fronted by counterculture firebrand Mick Farren, this group didn't care about commercial appeal. Their sound was jagged, raw, and deliberately confrontational. An abrasive cocktail of garage rock, psychedelia, and proto-metal grit. Their 1967 debut, Tuff, sounded less like an album and more like a Molotov cocktail hurled at the establishment. Songs like Deviation Street were fuzz-drenched and anarchic, snarling with political edge and unfiltered energy. The guitars screamed with distortion, the vocals sneered with attitude, and the rhythm section pounded with a kind of barely contained chaos. In a decade where polished psychedelia often dominated, the Deviants stood defiantly on the other side. Unhinged, heavy, and unwilling to compromise. They weren't just ahead of their time. They seemed to belong to a darker, heavier future. For the kids who encountered the Deviants back then, it was like stepping into another world. Picture a cramped London club, lights dim, bodies pressed tight, and Mick Farren spitting lyrics into the haze. The sound wasn't pretty, it was primal. Fans who were used to the polished harmonies of the Beatles or the whimsical psychedelia of Pink Floyd suddenly found themselves face to face with something far more dangerous. This wasn't music designed to comfort. It was music meant to provoke. Of course, the Deviants never hit the charts. They didn't have the mainstream breakthrough of their peers, nor did they soften their sound for radio. But that refusal to bend is what kept their legacy alive. They became cult heroes, influencing the rise of punk, noise rock, and even the grimy edges of early metal. Their underground ferocity echoed in the way heavy music would carry rebellion into the 1970s and beyond. Listening today, you can feel the unfiltered energy that the Deviants unleashed. They weren't aiming for stardom. They were aiming to tear down the walls and build something heavier in its place. For those who heard them then, or discover them now, it's a reminder that the seeds of metal didn't just grow from blues rock. Sometimes, they were planted in chaos. From halfway around the world, in New Zealand of all places, came a band that proved heaviness wasn't limited to the US, and UK Human Instinct may not have conquered the charts, but they carved out one of the rawest, most unhinged sounds of the late 60s. Their weapon was guitarist Billy T.K., often called the Maori Hendrix, whose fiery solos and feedback-drenched riffs pushed blues rock into wild, almost chaotic territory. By the time their 1969 record Burning Up Years hit, and especially with stoned guitar soon after, it was clear they were playing at proto-metal levels of intensity. Tracks like Stoned Guitar didn't just echo the psychedelic scene, they shattered it. The distortion was volcanic, the drumming pounded like a war drum, and the sheer improvisational fury felt like standing inside a live wire. Unlike polished studio rock, Human Instinct thrived on the edge of collapse, the music always threatening to spin out of control, yet somehow holding together. That tension gave their songs an almost dangerous allure. For fans who discovered them in the late 60s, Human Instinct was a revelation. Imagine being a young Kiwi rock fan, thousands of miles away from London or San Francisco, and hearing this storm of fuzz and feedback spilling out of local clubs. To kids spinning their battered vinyl copies, it was proof that even on the far edge of the world, the spirit of heavy rock was alive and thriving. For soldiers returning from Vietnam, stationed in New Zealand or Australia, this kind of sound was catharsis. Loud, aggressive, and perfect for drowning out memories they didn't want to revisit. Though Human Instinct never broke internationally, their cult status only grew. Collectors and proto-metal historians now treat stoned guitar like buried treasure, a document of just how global the heavy revolution had become. And Billy T.K.'s guitar work, often compared to Hendrix for its sheer audacity, still inspires awe among those who stumble across his recordings. Today, when you put the needle down on Human Instinct, it's easy to forget the band didn't play to arenas of thousands. Their sound was massive, unruly, and ferocious enough to sit comfortably beside the loudest names of their time. They were proof that heavy rock wasn't confined by geography. It was an attitude, a force of nature that could erupt anywhere.
Well, sir,
If you ever wondered where punk attitude and metal heaviness first collided, look no further than the Edgar Broughton Band. Rising out of Warwick, England, in the late 60s, this raw and rebellious trio took the blues foundation of rock and twisted it into something snarling, abrasive, and unrelentingly heavy. Their debut album, Wassa Wassa, released in 1969, was a sonic assault. Vocals barked more than sung, guitars drenched in fuzz and distortion, and rhythms that lurched forward with anarchic ferocity. It wasn't tidy, and that was exactly the point. Unlike polished contemporaries, the Edgar Broughton Band seemed to revel in chaos. Songs like Death of an Electric Citizen felt like proto-punk anthems wrapped in the distorted cloak of early metal. Edgar's voice was wild and untamed, his guitar tone thick with fuzz, and the rhythm section pounded with primal urgency. Listening to them was like stumbling across a street protest in full swing, angry, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. For an era so often remembered for its dreamy psychedelia, This was a jarring reminder that the counterculture had a darker, louder side. For fans who caught them live in cramped clubs or muddy festivals, the experience was unforgettable. Imagine yourself in 1969, standing shoulder to shoulder in a haze of cigarette smoke, the volume so high it rattled your chest. The band kicked into Death of an Electric Citizen, and suddenly the floor seemed to shake. This wasn't background music for a love-in. It was the soundtrack to revolution. Young fans left those shows buzzing, ears ringing, with the sense they'd just witnessed rock stripping itself of every polite convention and baring its teeth. Though they never found mainstream success, the Edgar Broughton Band left fingerprints all over the underground. Their refusal to play by the rules made them cult icons, embraced by those who wanted their rock rawer, heavier, and unapologetically defiant. In many ways, they bridged the gap between psychedelic heaviness, early metal, and the sneer that would later define punk. Their music may not have topped the charts, but for listeners who craved something louder and angrier, they were a revelation. Listening today, you can still feel the urgency in every fuzz-drenched note. The Edgar Broughton Band didn't just play songs, they launched sonic protests, blazing a path for both heavy rock and punk to follow. They might not be household names, but their legacy proves that sometimes the loudest voices come from the margins.
You gotta shake, rattle and roll. You better shake, rattle and roll. Boy, you
Detroit in the late 60s was a pressure cooker for loud, uncompromising rock, and the Frost fit that mold perfectly. Led by guitarist and vocalist Dick Wagner, who would later make his mark alongside Alice Cooper and Lou Reed, this band roared through Michigan clubs with a sound that was equal parts garage grit and proto-metal muscle. Their albums Frost Music and Rock and Roll Music, both released in 1969, showcased blistering guitar work and an energy level that rivaled anything coming out of the coasts. Wagner's guitar playing was at the heart of it all. He combined melody with ferocity, weaving soaring solos into riffs that felt like they could tear down walls. Songs like Black Train and Sweet Lady Love carried a weight that went beyond typical garage rock. They hinted at the heaviness that would soon define metal. Add in a powerhouse rhythm section and raw, passionate vocals, and you had a band that felt like a fuse waiting to ignite. For the fans who saw them live, the Frost were unforgettable. Picture a packed Detroit ballroom in 1969. Long-haired kids in denim jackets, amps stacked high, and Wagner leading the charge with his guitar screaming like a jet engine. The shows weren't just concerts. They were communal explosions of energy. Local fans swore the Frost were destined for national stardom. And in that moment, it felt inevitable. But outside of Michigan, the band never broke through. Despite releasing 2 strong albums and building a rabid regional following, the lack of major label support left them overshadowed by bigger names. To many, they became one of the great what-ifs of the late 60s rock scene. Yet, for those who held their vinyl or caught them live, the Frost carried the torch for a heavier, more aggressive brand of rock that Detroit would continue to champion through the 70s. Listening today, the Frost's recordings feel like snapshots of a band on the cusp of something larger. Wagner's later fame only reinforces how much raw talent was already present in those early years. They may not have climbed the charts, but their contribution to the DNA of heavy rock is undeniable. The Frost remind us that sometimes the loudest revolutions happen regionally, in sweaty clubs and hometown venues, long before the world ever catches on. When people talk about the darker side of 60s rock, few bands embodied it as fully as Coven. Formed in Chicago in the late 60s, Coven were unlike anything else in the scene. While their music was rooted in psychedelic hard rock, it carried a theatrical, occult edge that pushed them far beyond their peers. Their 1969 debut, Witchcraft Destroys Minds and Reaps Souls, wasn't just heavy, it was unsettling, draped in mysticism, ritualistic imagery, and lyrics that dealt openly with the occult years before Black Sabbath took similar themes global. Wicked Woman, thundered with distorted guitars, pounding bass, and Jinx Dawson's eerie, commanding vocals. What truly set them apart was how unapologetically they leaned into darkness. Where other bands hinted at rebellion, Coven embraced it fully, blending fuzz-drenched riffs with lyrics about witchcraft and forbidden rituals. For young rock fans, it felt dangerous, almost forbidden, the kind of record you hid from your parents but played on repeat with your friends when the lights were low. Those who saw them live in 1969 never forgot it. Dawson would lead ceremonies on stage, complete with inverted crosses and mock rituals, while the band roared behind her with feral energy. To kids in the crowd, this was rock stripped of all pretense, a glimpse of something darker and more theatrical that foreshadowed not just heavy metal, but also gothic rock and shock theatrics in the 70s. Long before Alice Cooper mainstreamed horror in rock, Coven were already there, casting spells through amplifiers. Of course, mainstream success was impossible. Their record label quickly grew nervous, and critics dismissed them as too strange, too dark, or too dangerous for radio. Yet, their cult legacy grew. Decades later, collectors rediscovered their debut as one of the earliest true occult rock artifacts, a record that pushed the boundaries of what rock could represent. Listening today, Coven's work feels astonishingly ahead of its time. Jinx Dawson's commanding voice paved the way for women in heavy music, while the band's embrace of theatrics and dark themes created a blueprint that countless metal acts would later follow. They might not have filled stadiums, but their influence lingers in every dark riff, every eerie lyric, and every theatrical stage show that dared to push beyond the ordinary. And there you have it, 10 obscure pioneers from the 60s who carried the torch of heaviness before the world even called it metal. These bands may not have filled arenas, but their riffs, raw power, and fearless spirit laid the foundation for everything that followed. They remind us that even in the shadows, history was being written one distorted chord at a time. Which of these forgotten heavyweights takes you back the most? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, keep it loud and keep the vinyl spinning.